Welcome to another episode of Tales from the Hangman's Record. My name is Steve Fielding. All the stories are taken from my 3-volume series of books, The Hangman's Record, covering every execution in Great Britain and Ireland between 1868 and 1964. Copies of these and many of my other titles can be obtained through my website, stevefielding.com. If you enjoy the video, can you please press like and subscribe to the channel? And if you can spare £1 or £2 to help it to continue to grow by clicking the thanks button on the YouTube video or the link paypal.me/thehangmansrecord, that will be greatly appreciated. And, as always, use the comments below for your thoughts on the case, whether justice was seen to be done, and suggestions for future episodes in this series. Today's tale from the Hangman's Record began in the autumn of 1942. The war in Europe marks a turning point and sees the arrival of the first American troops in Europe. It was a year of strict rationing, with many items like petrol and a wide range of food produce already strictly limited. Items like soap, sweets and chocolate, and then milk are rationed, with milk at 2.5 pints per adult per week. In February, Clement Attlee is appointed as the first Deputy Prime Minister, and a few weeks later, future Queen Elizabeth registers for war service. Although the Blitz ended in the previous year, the Luftwaffe still targets cities for bombing as part of the Baedeker raids, specifically choosing what are deemed places of cultural importance like York and Canterbury in a tit-for-tat revenge for British air raids over Germany. 1942 also saw the first broadcast of Desert Island Discs, and movies Mrs. Miniver and Yankee Doodle Dandy were amongst the most successful releases that year. At home, films such as Went the Day Well and In Which We Serve are released to help morale, and also in that year was the release of Vera Lynn's We'll Meet Again and the George Formby songs like Mr. Woo's a Windy Cleaner Now. It was also the year that saw the execution of the Blackout Killer in London, one of 20 hangings carried out that year in Great Britain. And, in the south of England, a military exercise uncovers a body that would lead to the start of one of Scotland Yard's greatest investigations. On the morning of Wednesday, the 7th of October 1942, a number of Royal Marines were carrying out training exercises at a spot called the Lion's Mouth at Howden Wood on Hankley Common near Godalming, Surrey, in the south of England. 2 soldiers were crawling through undergrowth near a large pile of earth that had been bulldozed into 20-foot mounds to simulate rough terrain training for tank crews when they spotted what appeared to be a human arm protruding through a patch of earth. Going to investigate, they found it was a badly decomposed human body. The exposed arm had the flesh of 2 of the fingers and the thumb gnawed away, presumably by rats or other vermin. The 2 soldiers immediately returned to base to report the find to their superiors. When an officer went to inspect the site and confirm their discovery, the police were immediately called. Officers from Surrey Constabulary were soon at the scene and immediately deduced that this called for the expertise of Scotland Yard detectives. A call was put through to the headquarters on the Thames Embankment in London, and the area around the remains cordoned off and secured until the arrival, later that day, of Detective Chief Inspector Edward Greenough and Detective Sergeant Fred Hodge. Also requested to attend were Dr. Eric Gardner, the pathologist to Surrey County Coroner, and London-based Home Office pathologist Dr. Keith Simpson. Both arrived at the crime scene on the following morning and began to slowly expose the remains from beneath the earth. The body was that of a woman, lying face down in a shallow makeshift grave, which must have been exposed by one of the military vehicles, possibly a half-track, that had loosened the soil, revealing the arm and the foot while preparing for the tank training. The earth that covered the body was just 4 inches at its deepest, with only a thin film of gravel over it. The woman was dressed in a green and white frock with a lace collar and woolen ankle socks. Her underclothing was in place, suggesting she had not been sexually assaulted. The left arm was folded beneath the chest, with the exposed right arm notably outstretched and the socks caught around the ankles. It would appear that the murderer had probably dragged his victim uphill to the location where she had been buried. The presence of 3 parallel scrapes on the skin of the right ankle, which corresponded with tears in the right sock, seemed to support this, and indicated that the victim was probably attacked elsewhere before dragged to the spot it was found. Greenough got the coroner's permission to take the body to Guy's Hospital in London to be cleansed in a bath of phenol, and the pathologist set about scooping the body up into a tarpaulin. Close examination found the body was badly decomposed, with the head, chest and abdominal cavity described by Dr. Simpson as being a seething mass of maggots which had eaten most of the soft body tissue, including the head and neck, leaving just a small section of scalp and hair. Cause of death was initially thought to be strangulation, but although there was a headscarf fastened around the victim's neck, the knot was very slack, allowing them to rule this out. The detectives and pathologists soon realised that the victim had most likely died from extensive blunt trauma to the skull, which had been badly shattered in what must have been a ferocious attack. The pathologists agreed that the extent of decomposition suggested that the victim had been killed between 5 and 7 weeks prior to discovery. Simpson was able to reconstruct the crime and deduced that the woman had been stabbed a number of times and then battered with a heavy weapon. The stab wounds were distinctive. In some wounds, particles of flesh had been pulled out, indicating that the knife must have some sort of hooked point, like a parrot's beak. On Thursday evening, the 8th of October, Dr. Simpson conducted an autopsy on the victim. He ascertained that the body was that of a Caucasian female, aged around 17 to 20 years old and approximately 5 feet 4 inches tall. Her natural hair colour had been sandy brown, but it had been cropped and bleached blonde several weeks before her death. Simpson made a careful reconstruction of the skull by wiring together the 38 fragments that could be found. This revealed a large hole at the rear of the skull. This injury, coupled with a fracture to the victim's right cheekbone, led pathologists to conclude that the victim had died as a result of the blow to the back of the head while she was lying down. The weapon which had delivered the fatal injury was a piece of wood, like a tree branch, and the blow had caved in the skull. These injuries would have caused rapid unconsciousness, and death would have followed within minutes. Numerous knife wounds were also discovered on the forehead, right forearm and right hand of the body, most likely inflicted before the victim had died. In addition to the knife and blunt trauma, the victim's jaw had been broken and 3 teeth dislodged. Dr. Simpson believed that these injuries had been inflicted while the victim was alive and most probably conscious. The presence of heat generated by the maggot infestation and the growth of the heather at the scene of the burial led Simpson to later revise the length of time the victim had lain undiscovered to 1 month. This meant she must have been killed in early to mid-September. But who was she, and what had led to her being found and buried in a shallow grave? A search of the common had begun once the body had been taken away, and a few days later the search team of over 60 police officers discovered a heavy, tapered birchwood bough about 350 yards from where the victim was buried. On closer inspection, several short strands of blonde human hair were discovered crushed into the bark. Simpson confirmed the dimensions were a perfect match to the cavity in the victim's skull, and the hair samples matched those retrieved from her scalp. 3 days later, within a 400-yard radius of the burial site, officers also discovered a number of personal artefacts, including a woman's shoes and purse, a handbag containing a rosary, a bar of soap and a distinctive elephant charm. A further clue to the identity of the dead woman was found in a nearby dell, close to where the suspected murder weapon had also been discovered. The search party had found a national registration card, a blank document issued by the Canadian Army to men requesting permission to marry, and a letter written to a Canadian soldier informing of a pregnancy and her hopes of him agreeing to marry her. The card identified the victim as 19-year-old Joan Wolfe, who had been living in a makeshift shelter built on the common by August Sangret, a 29-year-old French-Canadian Cree Indian soldier based at the nearby Whitley camp. Sangret was also the soldier named in the documents found near the body. With the mention of pregnancy and hopes of marriage, detectives reasoned this was a possible motive for murder. Born in Battleford, in the Saskatchewan province of Western Canada in August 1913, Sangret was a meaty, a descendant of mixed-race people born of relations between First Nation women and European men. He spoke English and the Cree language, and although he had learned many of the traditional skills of his ancestors, including how to construct shelters from poles covered with sheets, he had received little formal education and was essentially illiterate. Chief Inspector Greenough requested permission from the Canadian Army to interview August Sangret, and on Monday the 12th of October, the soldier was summoned to the guardroom. While he waited to speak to the Scotland Yard detectives, Sangret asked if he could use the adjacent washroom. The request granted, he was absent for 4 or 5 minutes before he returned, spoke to Inspector Greenough, and agreed to accompany him to Godalming for a formal interview. Sangret freely admitted to having dated Joan Wolfe, but insisted he had not seen her since Monday the 14th of September, when she had failed to keep a date with him. He said he had not taken the relationship seriously, as he was far more interested in a woman he had earlier met in Glasgow. Although he had not reported the woman missing to the police, he had told of her disappearance to his provost sergeant at the camp. Greenough was told that during the summer of 1942, the couple had spent a great deal of time together, and Sangret had built a traditional shelter for them to sleep in woodland near the camp at Whitley, where he was stationed. He said that after being warned by his superiors at the camp to stop living in wigwams on the common, they had then spent time in a fire-damaged cricket pavilion close by. Shown articles of clothing taken from the body, the Canadian identified them as belonging to Joan Wolfe. Sangret remained at the police station for the duration of the questioning, and a bed was made for him in one of the cells. He was given a change of clothing while his uniform was sent to Dr. Gerald Roach Lynch at St Mary's Hospital in Paddington to undergo testing. Lynch was able to confirm that both the trousers and a blanket taken from his hut at the camp had recently been washed, but each bore evidence of bloodstains. From his army blanket, Dr. Roach Lynch was able to work out that the positioning of the bloodstains would be consistent with where blood would have seeped from Wolfe's head and arms had she been wrapped in this garment. Greenough took Sangret back to the common to show him the various locations mentioned in his statement and the position of 2 wigwams he had constructed. He also took them to the cricket hut where they had stayed, which detectives saw was full of drawings and writings on the wall made by the dead girl. Sangret then told in detail of his relationship with Wolfe and his actions following her disappearance. He admitted that the last time he had seen her, they had argued over his reluctance to get married. He did, though, strenuously deny either causing her harm or of any knowledge of her current whereabouts. When questioned about the army knife, Sangret claimed he had given the knife to Joan Wolfe. Although they had found the wooden stake that had most likely caused the head injuries, they were unable to find the knife with the distinctive curved tip. The interviews carried out over 3 of the next 4 days resulted in a 17,000-word statement, at the time the longest ever taken in a British murder investigation. The questioning ended on Friday morning, the 16th of October, and with insufficient evidence to charge him with the murder, August Sangret was released pending further inquiries. Prior to leaving the station and returning to his barracks, he buried his head in his hands and told the detectives, "I suppose you have found her. Everything points to me. I guess I shall get the blame." Despite their strong suspicions, Greenough and his team knew that the missing piece of the jigsaw they needed was to find the knife with a distinctive point. Then, they got the break desperately needed to solve the case. On Friday the 27th of November 1942, a private was tasked with cleaning out a blocked drain at the latrine next to the guardroom at Whitley Camp. After scooping out all matter of material, something still blocked the drain, and as he reached deeper, he found something metallic wedged inside. Finally, after a bit of coaxing, he was able to remove a knife. It had a tip like a parrot's beak. The knife was one issued to soldiers in the Canadian Army prior to 1939. When Greenough was informed of the find, he recalled how Sangret had excused himself to use this washroom prior to the initial questioning. He had been alone in that room for 3 or 4 minutes, although the water had been cut off at the time. Once the knife had been recovered, hundreds of soldiers at the camp were interviewed to see if anyone could recognise it. Eventually, one told detectives that in August 1942, he had found a knife sticking in a tree close to the wigwam where Sangret and the dead girl had been living. He had taken the knife back to the camp and handed it to his corporal, who also remembered and recognised the knife. It had a distinctive hook point, and he had handed it back to August Sangret. Dr. Roach Lynch subjected the knife to the same testing he had done to Sangret's army blanket and uniform, although the knife, having been immersed in a drain for over 6 weeks, revealed no trace of blood, hair samples or fingerprints. Doctors Gardner and Simpson both examined the knife and concluded only such a weapon could have inflicted the wounds found on Wolfe's skull and arm. On Sunday afternoon, the 6th of December, Detective Chief Inspector Greenough interviewed Sangret at the Aldershot Barracks where he had recently been transferred. He was taken back to Hankley Common and asked to point out the locations he and Wolfe had lived. He refused to enter or even glance in the direction of Howden Wood. Back at the police station, Sangret agreed to submit to a second interview in which Greenough focused on the knife he and Joan Wolfe had owned. Sangret claimed that Wolfe had been in possession of the knife with the hook point, which he had been given by another Canadian soldier she was seeing before they met. He then claimed that the knife found in the drains must have been planted there by a Canadian military policeman. Shortly after 4 o'clock that afternoon, August Sangret was formally charged with the murder of Joan Pearl Wolfe and remanded in custody at Brixton Prison to await a committal hearing. These hearings were held at Guildford on the 12th of January 1943 and were to last 8 days. Over 20 members of the Canadian Army were called to testify as witnesses to a variety of things, such as Sangret's relationship with Joan Wolfe and his conflicting and indifferent accounts as to her whereabouts following the disappearance. They also give evidence of him being in possession of the knife unless it had been used in the murder, and also his movements on critical dates. Also giving evidence were Doctors Simpson, Gardner and Roach Lynch, who each testified as to their collective forensic findings upon the body and Sangret's clothing and army blanket. Also at his committal hearings was Chief Inspector Greenough, who read in full Sangret's voluminous statements to the court before telling of Sangret's admission prior to his initial release that he deduced these official matters were in motion due to her body being found. The trial of August Sangret for the murder of Joan Pearl Wolfe began at Surrey County Hall, Kingston, before Mr Justice McNaughton on the 24th of February 1943. Opening for the Crown, Eric Neave KC outlined the prosecution's intention to prove beyond reasonable doubt that August Sangret had murdered Joan Wolfe, who he referred to as the Wigwam Girl, on or about the 14th of September 1942. Neave told the court that Sangret had constructed wigwams with the same knife he had subsequently used in the murder before striking her with the birch bough, exhibited in court to inflict a substantial fracture at the rear of the skull. He then attempted to conceal the knife at Whitley Barracks. Neave said that Sangret had told several conflicting stories of Wolfe's whereabouts in the weeks she had been missing, and that forensic experts would testify that only a distinctive knife such as the one produced in court could have inflicted the wounds discovered on the arms and forehead. Furthermore, Dr. Roach Lynch would testify that the bloodstains on Sangret's trousers and army blanket were consistent with where blood would have seeped from Wolfe's head and arm, indicating he had wrapped her body in the blanket. In his opening speech for the defence, Sangret's counsel Linton Thorpe KC rejected the prosecution's contention that the knife alleged to be the murder weapon had belonged to Sangret, emphasising his client's insistence that he had never owned such a knife and that the knife in question was of a British Army issue as opposed to Canadian. Thorpe said that the accused loved Joan Wolfe and that following her disappearance he had made great efforts to locate her. Thorpe told the court that the dead girl had a history of liaising with soldiers in the 2 years prior to her murder, and coupled with her solitary and nomadic lifestyle, meant any number of the 100,000 soldiers stationed in the vicinity of Whitley and Thursley could have been the actual murderer. The relationship between Sangret and Wolfe had lasted 60 days before she disappeared. Sangret claimed before he returned from the pavilion to his barracks that morning, Joan had informed him of her intentions to go and stay with a friend. That was the last time he saw her. Sangret was known to have given conflicting explanations as to her whereabouts to his army colleagues in the weeks following her disappearance. To some, he claimed that she had returned home and the wedding was off. To others, he claimed that she was in hospital. Sangret had confided in his provost sergeant he and Joan had quarrelled after he informed her of his indifferent attitude to marriage. When Sangret had then asked why he was so concerned as to her whereabouts, given that he had no intention of marrying her, he replied, "If she has been found and anything has happened to her, I don't want to be mixed up in it." Doctors Simpson and Gardner testified as to the recovery of the body and the subsequent examination of the remains, both on the Common and at Guy's Hospital. With the aid of enlarged photographs of the wounds discovered on the skull, Simpson showed that only a knife such as that with the peculiarities of one discovered hidden in the waste pipe at the barracks could have inflicted the distinctive circular wounds. Then, in a sensational move, and against objections from the Defence Counsel, Dr. Simpson retrieved Wolfe's skull from a cardboard box to show just how the knife fitted the wounds. Upon completion of Defence Counsel questioning, Sangret was subject to an intense cross-examination by Eric Neave, who repeatedly raised the inconsistencies and contradictions in his claim, both in the trial testimony and the two statements he had given to Inspector Greenough. The trial of August Sangret lasted 7 days and saw 52 witnesses testify on behalf of the prosecution, with only Sangret himself testifying in his own defence. Following completion of both counsels' closing arguments, Mr. Justice McNaughton delivered his final instructions to the jury. That the girl was murdered is not in dispute. That she was murdered by some man is also quite plain. The only question you have to administer is, have the Crown satisfied you beyond all real doubt that the prisoner, August Sangret, is the man who murdered her? Following this, the jury retired to consider their verdict, taking with them Wolfe's skull and the knife. They deliberated for 2 hours before finding Sangret guilty of murder, although adding a strong recommendation for mercy. Before sentence was passed, Sangret was asked by the clerk of the assizes whether he wished to address the court. "I am not guilty, sir. I never killed that girl," he declared before the black cap was placed on the judge's wig and he was condemned to death. August Sangret immediately filed a notice of appeal, without first consulting his defence counsel. This was heard on the 13th of April, before the Lord Chief Justice Viscount Caldecott, Mr. Justice Humphreys and Mr. Justice Lewis. The appeal court upheld the conviction, ruling that there was no evidence presented to attest to either a trial misconduct or Sangret's innocence. Issues relating to the jury's recommendation to mercy were then lodged with the Home Secretary, Herbert Morrison, who shortly thereafter upheld the death sentence. At 9 o'clock on Thursday the 29th of April 1943, August Sangret was hanged at Wandsworth Jail by Albert Pierrepoint and assistant Harry Critchell. Prior to the burial later that morning, Dr. Simpson performed an autopsy, noting that apart from the deep imprint of the hangman's noose, the only other mark on the body was the name Pearl tattooed on his arm. On the 3rd of May 1943, Private August Sangret was posthumously inducted onto the list of Canadian servicemen who had died while serving overseas. The case marked the first occasion in the British legal history in which a murder victim's skull was introduced as evidence at a trial. Ted Greenough later recorded in his memoirs that this was nearly a perfect crime, a murder not only unsolved but almost undiscovered. Instead, it turned out to be what one newspaper called the detective achievement of the century, but it was the arm protruding from the shallow grave spotted by the 2 Marines that was to be a signpost to murder. August Sangret went to the gallows protesting his innocence and claiming, despite there being no evidence to support this, that he was framed by the Canadian military police. It was said when reviewing the case that although there was circumstantial evidence, it was overwhelming, and that Sangret was not of good character, having served a number of prison terms in his homeland. There was a strong recommendation for mercy, but the appeal court believed this was based on sympathy of a soldier travelling thousands of miles to help fight the enemy in Europe. Was this a miscarriage of justice? Based on the evidence as presented in court, it would suggest that, in this case, there wasn't, and he was, guilty as charged. You'll be watching another episode of Tales from the Hangman's Record. Until the next time, thank you and goodbye.